It happened so fast that my mind refused to catch up with my eyes. 1 second, I was standing in my driveway in Redwillow Ridge, smoke curling off the grill, laughing with my neighbor about overcooked burgers. The next second, 3 men in matching HOA security jackets came charging across the pavement like they were making an arrest. My guest barely had time to say, "Don't touch me," before one of them grabbed her arm and slammed her onto the concrete. Her purse exploded across the driveway. Papers, a phone, keys, everything scattered. And as she tried to push herself up, the man in charge leaned down, close enough that I could hear him clearly, and said in a calm, vicious voice, "Maybe crawling will teach you some respect." I felt my stomach drop. My hands went numb. These weren't police. They weren't deputies. They were hired HOA guards acting like they owned the street, the driveway, and the people standing on it. I stood there frozen, heart hammering, watching them threaten a woman whose only crime was showing up at my house. What they didn't know, what would change everything, was that the woman they had just thrown to the ground wasn't just my guest. She was the district attorney. And before this was over, the entire HOA was going to regret ever pretending they had that kind of power. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Redwillow Ridge looks like something pulled straight out of a glossy neighborhood brochure. Clean sidewalks that never seem to crack. Identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. Fresh fences, trimmed hedges, and lawns so perfect they don't look real. The HOA loved to describe it as a quiet, safe community designed to protect property values and resident well-being. That was the sales pitch anyway. I moved there because I wanted exactly that. Quiet evenings. Predictable routines. A place where neighbors waved, chatted about weather or weekend plans, and then went back to their lives. After years of apartment living and noisy streets, Redwillow Ridge felt like a reset, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. But from the very beginning, something felt wrong. It wasn't obvious at first. There were no shouting matches or public confrontations, no angry notes taped to doors. It was subtler than that, heavier. Like the air itself carried rules you couldn't see but were expected to obey. The HOA didn't just enforce guidelines, they watched people. White security SUVs were always parked somewhere nearby, engines running, windows tinted. Sometimes they sat at corners for hours. Other times they slowly rolled down the street at walking speed, like they were counting houses. Cameras appeared on light poles, one by one, no announcement, no vote, no explanation. One week they simply existed, angled just enough to see front doors and driveways. Every letter from the HOA arrived with polite language and a sharp edge. Friendly reminder, notice of concern, compliance request. None of them sounded friendly. They read like warnings dressed up in professional fonts. Follow the rules, or else. The president of the HOA, Carolyn Whitmore, loved to talk about order. At every community meeting, she used that word like it was sacred. Order kept us safe. Order preserved value. Order prevented chaos. She said it with a calm smile that never quite reached her eyes. She called it structure. I started calling it surveillance. People didn't linger outside anymore. Conversations ended quickly when a security vehicle slowed nearby. Curtains shifted when engines idled too long. Everyone acted polite, but it felt forced, like we were all playing roles in a neighborhood play where forgetting your lines came with consequences. The worst part was how normal it all seemed if you didn't look too closely. My guest that afternoon, Rachel Monroe, was never meant to be part of any of that. She was just coming over for a casual barbecue. No big event, no crowd. Just burgers, a few neighbors, and a quiet Saturday evening. Rachel mentioned she worked in government law when we first met, but she brushed it off like it was dull office work. Paperwork, meetings, policy reviews. She was calm in a way that made people underestimate her. Soft-spoken, observant. The kind of person who listened more than she talked. When she called to say she was running a little late, I didn't give it a second thought. Traffic happens, life happens, life happens. I told her to take her time. What I didn't realize was that while I was setting plates on the patio table, an HOA security vehicle had already been parked at the end of my driveway for nearly an hour. The engine was still running. The radio crackled every few minutes. The driver never got out. He just sat there, watching my house like it was under investigation. At the time, I noticed it but dismissed the feeling in my gut. I told myself they were just doing their job. Being vigilant, keeping the neighborhood safe. That's the thing about Redwillow Ridge. It trained you to doubt your instincts. If you questioned the constant presence, you were told you should be grateful. If you asked why cameras were pointed at private homes, you were told it was for everyone's protection. If you felt uncomfortable, the implication was that you were the problem, not the system. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. Neighbors who stopped inviting friends over, people who parked their cars a certain way to avoid attention. A quiet understanding that being noticed was dangerous, that blending in mattered more than being right. That afternoon felt normal on the surface. The grill was hot. The air smelled like charcoal and cut grass. A neighbor laughed at something trivial. Nothing about it felt like the start of a disaster. But the security vehicle didn't move. It stayed right where it was, engine humming, eyes fixed on my driveway, waiting. At the time, I told myself they were just doing their job. That was my mistake. Rachel pulled up right on time, easing her car into the driveway like anyone else visiting a friend on a quiet weekend. She stepped out, glanced at her phone to confirm the address, and started walking toward my front door with an easy, unhurried pace. Nothing about her looked suspicious. No rushing, no hesitation. Just a normal person heading to a barbecue. She made it about halfway up the driveway before someone cut directly in front of her. Derek Sloan appeared out of nowhere, moving with the kind of confidence people get when they think a uniform makes them untouchable. He didn't greet her. Didn't introduce himself. He planted his feet in her path and demanded identification, sharp and loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Not asked, demanded. Rachel stopped, clearly confused, and calmly asked why she needed to show identification just to walk to a private home. Sloan didn't explain. He didn't have to, at least in his mind. He told her her name was not on the approved guest access list. Later, when Rachel told me that phrase, I actually laughed out loud. I had lived there for years and had never heard of an approved guest access list. No one had ever mentioned it. No email, no letter, no meeting. It was the first time I realized how easily they could invent rules on the spot. Sloan's tone shifted when Rachel didn't immediately comply. His voice grew colder. He accused her of being a property reconnaissance risk, like she was casing houses instead of attending a cookout. The accusation was ridiculous, but it served a purpose. It gave him an excuse to escalate. That's when the other two guards moved in. Evan Price stepped behind her, close enough to block any chance of backing away. Luke Harris lifted his phone and started recording, angling it like he was collecting evidence for a crime that didn't exist. The three of them formed a tight triangle around her, cutting her off from the street and from my front door. I was watching from a few steps away, still processing what I was seeing, trying to decide whether this was some kind of misunderstanding that would dissolve if someone spoke up. Before I could say anything, Rachel tried to step around Sloan, not aggressively, not confrontationally. She just shifted her body, clearly intending to walk past him and knock on my door. That was all it took. Sloan grabbed her arm and yanked her backward with enough force that her feet left the ground. She hit the concrete hard, the sound sharp and sickening, like something breaking even though nothing did. Her purse flew out of her hand and burst open when it hit the driveway. Papers, keys, her phone, everything scattered across the concrete. The sound of her hitting the ground snapped me out of it. I ran toward them, yelling for them to stop, shouting that she was my guest, that they had no right. Sloan didn't even look at me. He raised his hand in my direction like I was the one causing trouble and told me to stand down or be detained. Detained. The word didn't make sense in my head at first. Detained by who? For what? We weren't in a police station. We weren't in a courthouse. We were standing in my driveway, in front of my house, surrounded by people paid by the HOA. Rachel was still on the ground, stunned but conscious, trying to push herself up on one elbow. That's when Sloan leaned down toward her. His voice dropped, slow and deliberate, loud enough that everyone could hear it. Maybe crawling will teach you some respect. The words landed harder than the fall. I felt my chest tighten with anger and disbelief. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. The way he said it made that clear. This was intentional, a performance, a message. Evan Price stood there watching, arms crossed, not saying a word. Luke Harris kept his phone trained on Rachel like he was documenting proof that she deserved what had just happened. None of them looked concerned. None of them looked unsure. They looked comfortable. That was the moment everything clicked. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about protecting property values or keeping the peace. Those were just the words they used to justify what they really wanted: control. They wanted to show her and everyone watching that they had the power to stop you, question you, touch you, and humiliate you, all without consequence. That they could invent authority where none existed and enforce it through fear. I realized then that if they were willing to do this in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, over something as harmless as a guest arriving at a barbecue, there was no limit to what they thought they could get away with. And standing there, watching Rachel pick herself up off the concrete while 3 HOA guards loomed over her, I understood something else too. They had no idea who they had just put their hands on, and they were about to find out. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel hitting the concrete again. Heard the sound, heard the way Sloan said those words like he enjoyed them. By the time morning came, any doubt I had left was gone. I wasn't asking for explanations. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was walking into the HOA office to demand accountability. The building itself was exactly what you'd expect from Redwillow Ridge: neutral colors, inspirational posters about community and harmony, soft lighting meant to calm you down before you even spoke. It felt less like an office and more like a place designed to make complaints dissolve before they reached a desk. Carolyn Whitmore was already waiting for me. She stood when I walked in, smiling warmly, hand extended like we were old friends meeting for coffee. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Not a single sign that anything unusual had happened the day before. She invited me to sit. I didn't. Before I could finish describing what her security team had done, she raised a hand gently, the way someone does when they want to slow a conversation they already control. She didn't deny anything. She didn't look confused. She simply reframed it. She called it a security interaction. Those were her exact words. She said the guards followed protocol and that their response was proportional to a perceived threat. She spoke calmly, carefully, like she had rehearsed every sentence. When I said the word assault, she smiled politely and corrected me. It wasn't an assault. It was a safety response. Then she told me there had been an update to guest access procedures. Emergency measures, she said, necessary ones. She suggested the notice had been sent out weeks earlier and implied that if I didn't see it, that was my responsibility. She slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. Inside were printed notices, highlighted sections, and itemized penalties. Fines for interference with security operations. Fines for unregistered guest access. Administrative fees. Processing fees. Compliance review charges. The total at the bottom made my chest tighten. It was more money than most people could afford without panic. Enough to make you hesitate. Enough to make you calculate how long your savings would last if you fought back. Carolyn watched my reaction carefully. She didn't rush. She let the number do its work. When I told her I was going to call a lawyer, her smile didn't fade. It sharpened. She leaned back in her chair and told me the HOA had anticipated situations like this. She explained, almost proudly, that Redwillow Ridge maintained a legal defense fund specifically designed to handle resident disputes. She named the firm they worked with, the kind of firm whose name alone was meant to scare people into compliance. Then she casually mentioned timelines. She talked about motions, delays, reviews, appeals, years, not months. She explained how even a simple case could drag on until legal fees became unbearable. She didn't threaten me directly. She didn't have to. The message was crystal clear. You can fight us if you want. You just won't survive it financially. She offered me an alternative: pay the fines, sign an acknowledgement, agree to comply moving forward, put the incident behind us. Her tone suggested this was the reasonable choice, the adult choice. I asked her if she had seen the video. Her eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, not surprise, not fear, calculation. She said video footage was under internal review, and that releasing it without authorization would be considered a violation, another potential fine. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't worried. Not about the fall, not about the witnesses, not about the footage. She spoke like someone who had done this before. Someone who knew the system worked in her favor because it wasn't designed for fairness. It was designed for endurance. She believed I would break, and honestly, I understood why. Standing there, holding that folder, listening to her explain how expensive justice could be, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. This was how they won. Not by being right, but by being relentless. As I stood to leave, Carolyn smiled again and reminded me that any further escalation on my part could be interpreted as harassment of HOA staff. She said it lightly, almost kindly, like she was offering advice. I walked out of that office shaking with anger. But underneath the anger was something else: clarity. They didn't care what their guards had done. They didn't care who got hurt. They cared about control, and they were confident they had enough money, lawyers, and manufactured authority to keep it. What Carolyn didn't know, what made her confidence so dangerous, was that the woman her guards had thrown to the ground wasn't intimidated by legal threats. And unlike most residents, I wasn't standing alone anymore. The HOA thought this was a battle of endurance. They had no idea it was about to become a battle of exposure. I called Rachel as soon as I got home from the HOA office. I was still angry, still shaking, still replaying Carolyn's smile in my head. The first thing I did was apologize. Over and over, for not stopping it sooner, for letting it happen in my driveway, for bringing her into something she never should have been dragged into. She didn't interrupt me. She listened quietly, letting me say everything I needed to say. When I finally ran out of words, there was a brief pause on the line. Then she spoke, calm and steady. Do not pay them a single dollar. There was no hesitation in her voice, no anger either. Just certainty. That was the moment her tone changed. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't talk about how shaken she had been. Instead, she started asking questions, precise ones. She wanted the names of the guards if I knew them. She wanted me to repeat exactly what was said, word for word, especially the part about crawling. She asked whether any neighbors were present, whether anyone had phones out, whether I had cameras on my house, and what angles they covered. I realized then that she wasn't asking as a victim. She was building a case. At one point, she stopped me and said very plainly, "Their opportunity to fix this has passed." The words sent a chill through me, not because they sounded threatening, but because they sounded final, like a door had just closed and could not be reopened. She told me to meet her downtown the next morning. No explanation. just a time and an address. The building she sent me to wasn't flashy. No towering signs, no dramatic entrances. Just a solid government structure with security at the door and a quiet sense of authority you could feel as soon as you walked in. Rachel met me in the lobby, dressed differently than I had ever seen her. Professional, composed, purposeful. She led me into a conference room and closed the door. That's when she stopped being careful with words. Rachel Monroe wasn't a consultant. She wasn't an assistant. She wasn't someone who worked around law. She was the district attorney for the county. She explained it plainly, like it was just another fact. She told me she kept her role vague outside of work because it made her life easier, because people treated her differently once they knew. Because sometimes it was better to listen than to announce who you were. What happened in my driveway, she told me, wasn't an HOA dispute. It wasn't a policy disagreement. It wasn't even a civil matter. It was felony territory. She broke it down piece by piece. The physical assault, the unlawful detention threat, the impersonation of authority, the coordinated nature of it. She explained how acting under color of law, even falsely, elevated everything. How pretending to have powers you don't legally possess can turn intimidation into a criminal offense. She told me this wasn't just about her. It was about every resident they had ever scared into silence. Every fine used as a weapon. Every rule invented on the spot to control people. Redwillow Ridge, she said, had crossed a line it could not uncross. She asked me one final question before we left the room. Are you willing to let this be bigger than you? I didn't even have to think about it. I nodded. That was the moment the story stopped being about an HOA bullying a homeowner and became about what happens when fake authority runs headfirst into real law. Carolyn Whitmore moved fast. Within 48 hours of the incident, every resident in Redwillow Ridge received an email marked Urgent Core. The subject line talked about unity, transparency, and restoring confidence. An emergency community meeting was scheduled for that evening in the clubhouse, and attendance was described as strongly encouraged. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Carolyn wasn't trying to apologize. She was trying to get ahead of the story. When I walked into the clubhouse, the room was already packed. Folding chairs filled every inch of space. People stood along the walls, neighbors I had barely seen outside their houses were suddenly whispering to each other, faces tight with worry. Some looked angry. Some looked scared. Others looked loyal, arms crossed, convinced this was all a misunderstanding that needed to be smoothed over. Carolyn stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen, calm as ever. She smiled, waited for the noise to die down, and began talking about how recent events had been exaggerated. She used phrases like miscommunication and isolated incident. She praised the HOA security team for their dedication and assured everyone that Redwillow Ridge remained one of the safest communities in the county. Derek Sloan stood off to the side, arms behind his back, wearing his uniform-like armor. He avoided eye contact, staring straight ahead as if this were just another routine briefing. Carolyn was halfway through her speech when the doors at the back of the room opened. Rachel walked in first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She simply walked down the aisle with steady, deliberate steps. Behind her were several men and women who did not look like HOA volunteers. Dark jackets, serious expressions. The kind of presence that immediately changes the temperature in a room. The murmurs started instantly. Carolyn stopped mid-sentence. She tried to recover quickly, forcing a smile and asking if she could help them. She said this was a private HOA meeting and suggested they leave and schedule an appointment. Rachel didn't argue. She reached into her jacket, pulled out her badge, and held it up where everyone could see it. She introduced herself as the district attorney. You could feel the shift ripple through the room. People straightened in their seats. Whispers turned into silence. Someone near the back let out a sharp breath. Carolyn's smile faltered for the first time. She tried again, insisting that the HOA would cooperate fully, but that the meeting needed to stay on track. Rachel nodded once and said she would be brief. Then she nodded toward the projector. The video started playing. It was worse seeing it on the big screen than it had been on my phone. Clear, unmistakable. Rachel walking up the driveway. Derek Sloan stepping into her path. The demand for identification. The accusation. The moment she tried to step past him, and then the grab. Gasps filled the room when she hit the ground. Someone covered their mouth. A chair scraped loudly as a person stood up in shock. The audio picked up everything, including Sloan's voice, as he leaned down and said the words about crawling. No one spoke. No one moved. The video kept playing, showing me running toward them, Sloan threatening to detain me, the other guards standing by and recording like this was routine. When the screen finally went dark, the silence was unbearable. Carolyn opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked around the room, searching for support that wasn't there anymore. Faces that had been nodding earlier now looked stunned, angry, betrayed. Rachel stepped forward and explained calmly what everyone had just witnessed. She didn't embellish. She didn't raise her voice. She named the violations, the assault, the impersonation of authority, the pattern of intimidation. She explained that this was not an isolated incident and that her office had already begun reviewing HOA records, finances, and complaints from other residents. She made it clear that the investigation was not starting that night. It was already underway. Derek Sloan finally moved, his confidence gone. He looked at Carolyn like he expected instructions. She gave none. When the investigator stepped forward and asked Sloan to come with them, a low murmur swept through the room. Someone shouted that this was insane. Someone else shouted that it was about time. Sloan was escorted out without resistance. Carolyn tried to speak again, her voice shaking now, insisting the HOA had always acted in good faith. Rachel looked at her and said nothing. She didn't need to. Every lie had collapsed right there in front of everyone who had believed it. The meeting ended not with applause or shouting, but with people sitting in stunned silence, realizing that the authority they had lived under for years had never been real, and that the consequences were finally catching up. The room didn't erupt when Derek Sloan was taken away. That was the strangest part. There was no shouting, no cheering, no dramatic reaction. Just a heavy, stunned quiet as the investigators guided him toward the exit. The same man who had stood so confidently in front of the projector minutes earlier now looked smaller, his shoulders tight, his eyes darting around the room like he was finally realizing he didn't own it anymore. Evan Price and Luke Harris were pulled aside next. Not handcuffed, but separated, questioned. Their phones were taken, their confidence drained away as quickly as Sloan's had. They weren't being treated like security anymore. They were being treated like witnesses. Rachel stood at the front of the room and waited until Sloan was gone before she spoke again. She told the residents that what they had just seen was not an isolated incident or a single lapse in judgment. She explained that once her office started looking into Redwillow Ridge, patterns emerged almost immediately, complaints that had gone nowhere, fines issued without proper documentation, security reports that read more like intimidation logs than safety records. Then she talked about money. She explained how the HOA's financial records raised serious questions. Where the fines went, how much of the budget was being poured into security contracts, how similar enforcement tactics appeared in other neighborhoods managed by the same leadership and consultants. This wasn't just one community. It was a system. As she spoke, you could see people connecting dots in real time. Heads nodding slowly, faces hardening as memories resurfaced. A neighbor near the front whispered that the same guards had once threatened her teenage son for sitting on a curb. Someone else mentioned a friend in a different development who had been fined repeatedly for non-compliance without ever being told what the violation was. The fear in the room began to shift. It was turning into anger. Carolyn Whitmore had been standing silently near the front, arms crossed, jaw tight. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was cracking. When Rachel finished speaking, Carolyn glanced toward the door. It was a small movement, but everyone saw it. She took a step back, then another. Rachel noticed too. Before Carolyn could reach the exit, an investigator stepped into her path. Calm, professional, unmovable. She was informed that she needed to remain on site, that there were questions to answer, documents to be secured, statements to be taken. Carolyn protested, her voice sharp now, the polished calm gone. She said this was harassment, that the HOA had legal counsel, that she had rights. Rachel listened and nodded once. Then she explained, clearly and publicly, that when an organization presents itself as an authority and uses force, threats, and intimidation to control residents, it crosses into criminal territory, especially when that authority is fabricated. What the HOA had been calling order, Rachel said, met a very different definition under the law. Extortion, conspiracy, abuse of power. The words landed hard. Carolyn's face went pale. For the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely afraid, not of bad press or angry residents, but of consequences she could no longer deflect. Investigators began collecting materials from the HOA office that night: hard drives, contracts, financial ledgers, security logs. The projector screen that had been used to spin reassurance earlier now felt like a spotlight exposing everything they had hidden. Residents lingered long after the meeting should have ended. Small groups formed, voices low but intense. Stories came out, incidents that had never been reported because people were too scared or too tired to fight. People realized they hadn't been alone. They had been isolated on purpose. That was the real power of the moment. Fake authority thrives in silence. Once that silence broke, it had nothing left to stand on. By the time I left the clubhouse, police vehicles and unmarked cars lined the street outside. Red and blue lights reflected off the same white fences that once symbolized order and safety. Neighbors stood on sidewalks watching, not with fear, but with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The HOA that had ruled Redwillow Ridge through fear and fines had been exposed for what it truly was: not a guardian of community values. A control racket, hiding behind rules and pretending to be law. What followed didn't happen all at once. It happened in waves. The first wave was shock. The second was anger. And the third, slow, steady, and impossible to stop, was people finally finding their voices. Within days of that meeting, the old board was suspended, not asked to step aside, not reviewed, removed. An emergency election was announced, overseen by outside administrators instead of the usual HOA insiders. For the first time since Redwillow Ridge existed, the people running the vote weren't connected to the people being voted on. That alone felt unreal. Then came the letters. Not warnings this time. Not friendly reminders. Actual apologies. Carefully worded, legally cautious, but unmistakable. Residents were informed that fines issued under the previous administration were under review. A week later, checks started arriving. Refunds, some small, some painfully large. Money people had paid just to make problems disappear. I watched neighbors stand at their mailboxes staring at envelopes like they didn't trust what they were seeing. Rules were frozen, then rewritten. Not behind closed doors, not buried in dense language, but out in the open. Meetings were announced publicly. Drafts were shared. Feedback was invited and actually listened to. The word security was replaced with community liaison, and the white SUVs vanished almost overnight. The cameras came down. One by one, the poles were cleared. No announcements. No ceremonies. Just the quiet disappearance of lenses that had made everyone feel watched. Kids started riding bikes again without parents hovering. People sat on their porches longer. Conversations stretched instead of ending abruptly when engines slowed nearby. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started talking. At the first open forum, people stood up with shaking hands and told stories they had kept buried. A retired couple who had been fined repeatedly for a flag. A single mother threatened with penalties over chalk drawings on her driveway. A teenager questioned and photographed by security for waiting for a ride after dark. Each story peeled back another layer of fear, and with every story shared, the room grew lighter. Not because the past disappeared, but because it was finally being acknowledged. I saw people apologize to each other for not stepping in sooner, for assuming someone else would speak up, for believing they were alone. The silence that fake authority depends on was gone, replaced by something louder and far more dangerous to it. Community. The new board wasn't flashy, no grand speeches. No talk of dominance or control. Just neighbors who wanted the same thing most people do, to live without being afraid of breaking invisible rules. They put limits on enforcement, clear definitions, transparent processes, and most importantly, accountability. When someone asked whether security would ever return in the same form, the answer was immediate: no. Redwillow Ridge didn't need to be policed. It needed to be trusted. The change wasn't dramatic in the way arrests had been. It was quieter, softer, but somehow more powerful. Lawns stopped looking staged. They started looking lived in. People hosted gatherings again. Friends visited without anxiety. The driveway where everything had started became just a driveway again. One evening, a few weeks later, I fired up the grill in the same spot as before. This time, no idling engines, no eyes watching from a distance. Just neighbors wandering over, asking what smelled so good. Rachel stopped by too. Not as the district attorney, just as a friend. She blended in easily, laughing with people who now understood exactly what she had done for them, even if she never said it out loud. Redwillow Ridge finally felt like what it had always pretended to be. A place where rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. What still sticks with me isn't that the HOA lost in the end, it's how long they were allowed to win. They didn't rely on being right. They relied on wearing people down. On fear, paperwork, fines, and the quiet pressure that comes from knowing any pushback could cost more than most families can afford. They built a system where staying silent felt safer than speaking up, and for a long time, that system worked exactly as designed. Until they put their hands on the wrong person. Rachel didn't tear the HOA down with anger or theatrics. She didn't shout or threaten. She did something far more dangerous to fake authority. She made it visible. She forced everyone to see what had been happening in plain daylight, without excuses, without softened language, without spin. And once the truth was out in the open, the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. The rules didn't protect people. They protected power. The order wasn't about safety, it was about control. And the moment real law stepped in, that illusion didn't just crack, it shattered. What I learned from all of this is simple but hard to forget. Power without accountability always turns into abuse. Every single time. And bullies only look strong until they're forced to answer to something real. Redwillow Ridge didn't just change leadership. It reclaimed its dignity. And watching that happen reminded me that silence is exactly what systems like this depend on. So if you're living somewhere that feels more like a monitored zone than a home, trust your instincts. You're probably not imagining it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?